The snow fell like a shroud over the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16th, 1944, muffling the sound of what would become Germany's final desperate offensive on the Western Front. Sergeant William Bill Thompson, of the 106th Infantry Division, pressed his back against the frozen trunk of a pine tree, his breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air as he peered through the pre-dawn darkness. Something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. Thompson had been stationed in this supposedly quiet sector for 3 weeks, part of the 14th Cavalry Group's reconnaissance mission along the German border. The brass had assured them this was a rest area, a place where green troops could get their feet wet and battle-worn veterans could catch their breath. The Siegfried Line lay just beyond the tree line. But intelligence reports suggested the Germans were finished, their war machine grinding to a halt under the relentless pressure of the Allied advance. The first sound that shattered the morning stillness wasn't the crack of a rifle or the whistle of incoming artillery. It was something far more ominous. The deep, mechanical rumble of tank engines echoing through the valley like distant thunder. Thompson's blood turned to ice water as he recognized the distinctive growl of German panzer tanks, a sound that had haunted American nightmares since the landings at Normandy 6 months earlier. "Holy Mother of God," whispered Private Jimmy Martinez, a 19-year-old farm boy from Texas who had joined Thompson's squad only 2 weeks prior. His hands trembled as he gripped his M1 Garand rifle, the metal so cold it seemed to burn. Through his thin gloves, "Sarge, that ain't ours, is it?" Thompson didn't answer immediately. He was counting the sounds, trying to estimate numbers, calculating the impossible. According to every intelligence report they'd received, the Germans had maybe a handful of operational tanks left in this entire sector. What he was hearing suggested something entirely different, something that defied every assumption the Allied command had made about German capabilities. The truth was even more terrifying than Thompson could have imagined. Hidden in the depths of the Eifel Mountains, Adolf Hitler had been planning what he called Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, its massive counteroffensive designed to split the Allied forces and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. More than 250,000 German troops, 1,300 tanks and assault guns, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces had been secretly massed for this operation, now known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. As referenced in declassified military documents from the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the German High Command had achieved complete tactical surprise, catching American forces in what General Omar Bradley would later describe as their most vulnerable position since Pearl Harbor. The fog began to lift just as the first German shells screamed overhead, their explosive impact sending geysers of frozen earth and splintered wood into the air. Thompson grabbed Martinez by the shoulder and pulled him deeper into the forest as machine gun fire began chattering from multiple directions. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the green American troops of the 106th Infantry Division were about to face their baptism by fire in the most brutal winter campaign of the Second World War. "Move, move," Thompson shouted over the growing din of battle, knowing that survival in the next few hours would depend entirely on cold calculation, desperate courage, perhaps a miracle or two. The German attack came in waves, each more devastating than the last. Captain Robert Hayes, of the 7th Armored Division's Combat Command B, watched in horror through his binoculars as Panzer IV and Panther tanks emerged from the morning mist like prehistoric monsters, their long guns already trained on American positions. The sight defied everything he had been told about German capabilities in this sector of the front. "Sir, we've got at least a full regiment of armor moving up the Clairvaux Road," reported Lieutenant David Morgan, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. The young officer had graduated from West Point just 18 months earlier and had never seen combat on this scale. "Our 37th Tank Battalion is requesting immediate support." Hayes lowered his field glasses and felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. His combat command consisted of barely 60 Sherman tanks and a handful of tank destroyers formidable against infantry, but woefully outgunned by the German panzers advancing through the valley. Below, the math was simple and terrifying. They were outnumbered 3-1 by an enemy that had achieved complete surprise. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate transmissions from units across the Ardennes front. The 424th Infantry Regiment was being overrun at Hosingen. The 110th Infantry Regiment had lost contact with two of its battalions. Most ominously, reports were coming in of German paratroopers landing behind American lines. Sowing confusion and cutting communication cables, what Hayes and his men didn't know was that they were facing the 5th Panzer Army under the command of General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most capable armored commanders. Manteufel's forces had been specifically tasked with breaking through American defenses and reaching the Meuse River within 48 hours. Timeline that required them to crush any resistance with overwhelming force and speed. The first German probe came at 0900 hours. When a column of Panzer IVs approached the village of Clairvaux along the main road, Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien, commanding an M for Sherman named Boston Bruiser, waited until the lead German tank was less than 800 yards away before giving the order to fire. The 76mm gun of his Sherman roared, sending a high-velocity, armor-piercing round screaming toward the enemy. Panzer. The shot struck the German tank's frontal armor and bounced off harmlessly, the tungsten core ricocheting into the forest with a metallic whine. O'Brien's heart sank as he realized what every American tanker feared most. They were facing an enemy with superior armor and firepower. Traverse left. Load high explosive. O'Brien shouted to his gunner, Corporal Eddie Kowalski, a mechanical genius from Detroit who could work miracles with the Sherman's cannon. But before they could fire again, the German Panzer's long 75mm gun spoke with deadly authority. The armor-piercing shell penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor as if it were paper, the molten metal core continuing through the fighting compartment with devastating effect. O'Brien felt the concussion wave lift him off his feet as secondary explosions began cooking off the tank's ammunition storage. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear Kowalski screaming for help, trapped in the driver's compartment, as flames began to engulf the interior of their tank. What followed was a scene repeated dozens of times across the Ardennes that morning. American crews abandoning their burning tanks. German armor advancing relentlessly through positions that had seemed secure just hours before, and young soldiers learning that modern warfare could transform peaceful winter landscapes into industrial hellscapes in a matter of minutes. By noon, on December 16th, the German breakthrough was complete across a front of nearly 60 miles. American commanders were beginning to realize they faced not a local spoiling attack, but a full-scale offensive that threatened to change the entire course of the war in Europe. By December 20th, 1944, the strategic crossroads town of Bastogne had become the focal point of the German offensive and the symbol of American defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division stood in the basement of the Heinz Barracks, studying a map that told a story of encirclement and desperation. Red arrows marked German positions on three sides of the town, while blue symbols showed his own force's parade troopers, who had been rushed to this critical position without adequate winter equipment or heavy weapons. "Sir, the Germans are requesting our surrender," reported Major William Desabry, holding a typed message that had been delivered under a white flag just minutes earlier. The German ultimatum was formal and ominous, warning that failure to surrender within 2 hours would result in the complete destruction of the American garrison. McAuliffe read the message twice, then looked up at his staff officers with an expression that mixed incredulity with dark humor. The situation was indeed desperate. His paratroopers were low on ammunition, critically short of medical supplies, and completely surrounded by elements of the 2nd Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division.
Ow.
But surrender was not an option. "For the screaming eagles of the 101st Airborne, tell them nuts," McAuliffe replied, using the single word that would become one of the most famous responses in military history. When Colonel Joseph Harper asked how he should translate this uniquely American expression for the German commander, McAuliffe simply said, "Tell them to go to hell." The defense of Bastogne had begun 3 days earlier when advance elements of the Airborne Division, including the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment under Colonel Howard Johnson, had arrived to find the town already under attack by German armored spearheads. What followed was a desperate battle for control of the road network that connected Bastogne to the rest of Belgium roads that the Germans needed to maintain their offensive momentum toward Antwerp. Private First Class Eugene Rodriguez of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment crouched in a hastily dug foxhole on the northern outskirts of town, watching German infantry advance across the snow-covered fields through the sight of his M1 Garand. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and his hands were so numb he could barely feel the trigger of his rifle. Around him, other paratroopers waited in similar positions, their olive-drab uniforms providing stark contrast against the white landscape. "Here they come again," whispered Sergeant Frank Perkenty, veteran of the Normandy campaign who had learned to read the rhythm of German attacks. The enemy came in predictable waves. First, an artillery barrage to suppress American positions, then infantry supported by the occasional panzer or assault gun. Finally, a withdrawal to reorganize before the next attempt, as documented in official after-action reports from the 101st Airborne Division. The paratroopers at Bastogne faced not only the enemy, but also severe shortages of everything. Needed to sustain combat operations in winter conditions, Rodriguez squeezed off his first shot at a German soldier advancing through the snow. Watching the enemy trooper spin and fall, the Garand's distinctive ping as it ejected its empty clip echoed across the battlefield, immediately answered by the sharp crack of German Mauser rifles and the deadly chatter of MG-42 machine guns. The battle for Bastogne became a grinding test of endurance. With American paratroopers holding defensive positions against repeated German assaults while waiting for relief forces to break through the encirclement, medical supplies ran so low that Army doctors were forced to operate without anesthesia, using liquor requisitioned from local establishments to sterilize wounds and dull the pain of surgery as night fell on December 20th. The citizens of Bastogne huddled in their cellars while the sound of artillery and small arms fire echoed through the streets. Above them, American and German forces fought for control of a town that had become synonymous with courage under fire, and the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. The siege of Bastogne would continue for 6 more days. But famous response had already signaled to both friend and foe that the American spirit remained unbroken despite the shocking success of the German surprise attack. The war crimes began on December 17, 1944, at a crossroads near the Belgian village of Malmedy, casting a dark shadow over what was already the bloodiest battle American forces had yet faced in Europe. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, DOF, Adolf Hitler was driving his armored spearhead toward the Meuse River when his advance guard encountered a convoy of American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. What happened next would become one of the most infamous war crimes of the Second World War. After forcing the American soldiers to surrender and disarm, Peiper's SS troops herded approximately 150 prisoners into a snow-covered field beside the road. Without warning or provocation, German machine gunners opened fire on the defenseless Americans, methodically executing prisoners who had surrendered in good faith, according to the Geneva Conventions. Private First Class Ted Pellew of the 285th Field Artillery had been returning from a forward observation post when his truck convoy ran directly into Peiper's advancing column. Unlike the infantry units that had been fighting in the Ardennes for days, Pellew and his fellow artillerymen were not prepared for close combat with German armor. Their surrender had been immediate, and they believed would guarantee their survival according to the established rules of warfare. Pellew threw himself face down in the snow when the shooting began, feeling the impact of machine gun bullets striking the bodies of men around him. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth as he bit through his own tongue to avoid crying out, knowing that any sound might draw the attention of the SS guards who were walking among the bodies, finishing off wounded survivors with pistol shots to the head for nearly 3 hours. Pellew lay motionless in the freezing mud created by melting snow and American blood, listening to the diminishing sounds of German voices and vehicle engines as Peiper's column continued its advance toward the west. Only when complete silence had settled over the killing field did he dare to lift his head and survey the carnage around him. The news of the Malmedy massacre spread through American units across the Ardennes front with the speed of wildfire, transforming what had been a conventional military campaign into something far more personal and savage. According to classified intelligence reports later declassified by the National Archives, word of the atrocity reached frontline commanders within hours, fundamentally changing the nature of combat in the remaining weeks of the Battle of the Bulge. Staff Sergeant Robert Martinez of the 30th Infantry Division received the news while his unit was establishing defensive positions near Stavelot, just 20 miles from the massacre site. Martinez had fought through North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy without developing personal hatred for individual German soldiers, whom he generally regarded as professionals doing their duty under difficult circumstances. The report from Malmedy changed that perspective permanently. No prisoners, Martinez told his squad as they prepared defensive positions along the approaches to Stavelot. SS troops killed our boys after they surrendered. Word is we don't take any SS alive. The order violated official military policy. But it reflected a new reality that would characterize American combat operations for the remainder of the European campaign. The psychological impact of the Malmedy massacre extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. American soldiers who had previously fought with restraint and adherence to the laws of war now faced an enemy who had demonstrated complete disregard for those same laws. The result was an escalation in violence that made the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement American forces experienced in the European theater. Piper's armored spearhead continued its advance toward the Meuse River. But the momentum of the entire German offensive was already beginning to slow as American reserves rushed toward the breakthrough area in winter weather, grounded the Luftwaffe support that had been crucial to early German success. The massacre at Malmedy had hardened American resolve at precisely the moment when German forces most needed to maintain their rapid advance toward strategic objectives. By nightfall, on December 17th, the character of the Battle of the Bulge had fundamentally changed from a conventional military operation to a bitter struggle for survival in which both sides understood that defeat might mean death even after surrender. General George S. Patton Jr. stood before a room full of staff officers at his 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, on the evening of December 19th, 1944, studying a situation map that showed German forces penetrating 60 miles into Allied territory. Legendary commander, known for his ivory-handled pistols and profanity-laced speeches, was facing the greatest challenge of his military career, executing a 90-degree turn of his entire army to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. Gentlemen, we are going to accomplish something that has never been done in military history, Patton announced to his assembled division commanders, his voice carrying the confidence that had made him the most feared American general in the European theater. They're going to pivot 3 full divisions from their current positions facing the Siegfried Line and drive north to break the German offensive within 72 hours. The task seemed impossible by conventional military standards. Patton's Third Army consisted of more than 250,000 men, 1,500 tanks, and thousands of support vehicles spread across a front of nearly 100 miles. Turning such a massive force 90 degrees while maintaining combat effectiveness would require logistical coordination on a scale that had never been attempted under combat conditions. General John Milliken of the 3rd Corps expressed the concerns shared by every officer in the room. Sir, the weather forecasts are calling for continued snow and freezing temperatures. Our tank units are already operating below 50%. Mechanical availability due to the cold, moving that many vehicles over icy roads in winter conditions. Patton cut him off with a gesture that had become familiar to everyone who served under his command. The weather affects the Germans just as much as it affects us, General. The difference is that American soldiers and American equipment are going to perform better under adverse conditions because that's what Americans do. The general's confidence was infectious, even among officers who understood the enormous challenges they faced. The relief operation began at 0600 hours on December 22nd, when lead elements of the 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey began their advance north from positions near Ardennes, Belgium. The division's combat command, A. led by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, spearheaded the attack with a column of Sherman tanks and armored infantry that stretched for miles along the narrow. Belgian Rhodes. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Johnny Say-Sorgen, Johnny Williams of the 8th Tank Battalion felt the familiar vibration of his Sherman's 500 horsepower engine as the massive column began moving toward Bastogne. Williams had fought under Patton since the Sicily campaign. He knew that their commander's reputation for achieving impossible objectives was built on the fighting ability of soldiers exactly like the crew of his tank, which they had nicknamed Memphis Belle, after Williams' hometown in Tennessee. The advance toward Bastogne became a race against time, as German forces intensified their attacks on the surrounded garrison while simultaneously rushing reserves to block Pétain's relief column. Combat Command A fought a series of sharp engagements with elements of the 5th Parachute Division and the Führer Grenadier Brigade, German units that had been specifically positioned to prevent any relief of the Bastogne defenders. As referenced in the official history of the Third Army compiled by the U.S. Army Center of Military History, Patton's forces covered nearly 60 miles of enemy-held territory in less than 4 days. Despite facing organized resistance in some of the worst winter weather conditions experienced during the entire European campaign, the critical breakthrough came on December 26th, when Abrams' Combat Command A smashed through German defenses south of Bastogne and established contact with elements of the 101st Airborne Division. The relief of Bastogne marked the beginning of the end for the German offensive. As Hitler's last great gamble in the West had failed to achieve its strategic objectives within the narrow time window available before Allied reserves could be brought to bear, Williams and his crew were among the first Allied soldiers to enter Bastogne after the siege was broken. The scenes they witnessed would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Paratroopers emerged from basement shelters and foxholes, looking more like scarecrows than soldiers. Their uniforms torn and filthy, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of men who had faced death and refused to yield. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit on January 3rd, 1945. As American forces launched their counteroffensive to eliminate the German salient that had become known as the Bulge, Technical Sergeant Michael O'Malley of the 87th Infantry Division pressed his face against the frozen earth of his foxhole, feeling ice crystals form in his beard as he watched German positions through the scope of his Springfield sniper rifle. O'Malley had been fighting in the Ardennes for 18 straight days, and the constant exposure to sub-zero temperatures had pushed his body beyond the normal limits of human endurance. His feet had lost all feeling 3 days earlier, a condition that Army medics called trench foot, but which soldiers knew could lead to amputation if left untreated. The irony was that O'Malley couldn't spare the time to seek medical attention, because his marksmanship skills were desperately needed to support the infantry assaults that were slowly pushing German forces back toward their original positions. The winter of 1944 to
1945 was the coldest in European
memory, with temperatures that turned the Ardennes forest into a frozen wasteland, where simple survival became as challenging as combat operations. American soldiers faced an enemy that was not only fighting desperately to avoid complete defeat, but also weather conditions that killed through exposure as efficiently as bullets or artillery shells. Lieutenant Colonel William Tucker of the 310th Infantry Regiment led his battalion through knee-deep snow toward the German-held village of Huffelise, knowing that his men were operating at the very edge of their physical capabilities. Tucker had lost nearly 30% of his effective strength to cold weather injuries, frostbite, hypothermia, and respiratory infections that turned routine military operations into exercises in survival. "Keep moving, keep your blood flowing," Tucker shouted to his troops as they advanced across an open field swept by German machine gun fire. The colonel knew that soldiers who stopped moving in these temperatures might never get up again, regardless of enemy action. The human body simply could not maintain core temperature while remaining stationary in sub-zero wind conditions. Private Danny Morrison of the 310th Infantry felt the familiar burning sensation in his lungs as he breathed the crystalline air while running toward German positions. Morrison had grown up in Minnesota and thought he understood cold weather, but nothing in his civilian experience had had prepared him for the brutal combination of combat stress and extreme winter conditions that characterized the Battle of the Bulge. The attack on Houffalize began at dawn with an artillery barrage that sent hundreds of shells, screaming over American positions toward German defensive lines. But the extreme cold affected even the performance of artillery pieces, with gun crews reporting that their weapons were firing short due to the decreased efficiency of propellant charges in sub-zero temperatures, as documented in medical reports. From the European theater of operations, American forces suffered more than 15,000 cold weather casualties during the Battle of the Bulge, nearly equaling the number of soldiers wounded by enemy action. German resistance remained fierce despite the deteriorating strategic situation, with Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht units fighting from prepared positions that took advantage of natural terrain features, machine gun nests positioned in stone farmhouses, and concrete bunkers provided interlocking fields of fire that forced American infantry to assault across open ground, where they became easy targets for enemy marksmen. Morrison threw himself behind a low stone wall as German bullets snapped overhead, the sound of high-velocity rifle rounds creating a deadly symphony that had become the soundtrack of his war. Around him, other members of his squad sought whatever cover they could find while their platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Carlos Rodriguez, coordinated with supporting tank units for the next phase of the attack. The battle for Houffalize would continue for another 6 days, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. German forces were being systematically pushed back toward their original positions. Hitler's last great offensive in the West was collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied counterattacks and the brutal winter weather that affected both sides equally. By evening on January 3rd, American forces had advanced nearly 2 miles toward their objective, leaving behind a trail of abandoned equipment, frozen corpses, and the detritus of modern warfare conducted under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The last German resistance. In the Ardennes collapsed on January 28, 1945, when elements of the 1st and 3rd Armies linked up near Houffalize, Belgium, effectively eliminating the salient that had threatened Allied strategy for 6 weeks. Major General Lawton Collins of the 7th Corps stood on a hilltop overlooking the town that had become the symbol of American perseverance in the face of Germany's final, desperate gamble. Collins surveyed a landscape that bore little resemblance to the peaceful farming region it had been before December 16th. The rolling hills and dense forests of the Ardennes were now scarred by countless shell craters, burned-out vehicles, and the debris of modern warfare conducted under the most brutal conditions imaginable. Snow-covered mounds marked the graves of soldiers from both armies who had died in what became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces during the Second World War. Captain James Mitchell of the 2nd Armored Division's Combat Command B approached Collins with the final casualty reports from his unit sector. The numbers told a story of sacrifice that would echo through American military history. More than 19,000 Americans killed, 47,000 wounded, and 23,000 missing or captured during the 6-week battle. German losses were equally devastating, with an estimated 100,000 casualties that the Wehrmacht could not afford to replace. "Sir, we've counted more than 600 German tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned in our sector alone," Mitchell reported, his voice hoarse from weeks of shouting orders over the din of combat. Intelligence estimates suggest that Germans lost nearly all their strategic reserves in this offensive. The Battle of the Bulge had indeed accomplished something that no previous Allied operation had managed: the complete destruction of Germany's ability to conduct major offensive operations on the Western Front. Hitler's gamble had not only failed to achieve its strategic objective, splitting Allied armies and recapturing Antwerp, but had also consumed the last reserves that might have been used to defend the German homeland against the coming Allied invasion. Sergeant William Thompson, the same reconnaissance soldier who had first detected German preparations on December 16th, stood among the ruins of a German supply depot near St. Vith, counting equipment that told the story of a broken army. Thousands of small arms, hundreds of artillery pieces, and mountains of ammunition had been abandoned by German forces retreating toward the Siegfried Line under relentless Allied pressure Thompson had survived 43 days of continuous combat, from the initial German surprise attack through the desperate defense of key crossroads towns to the final Allied counteroffensive that restored the original front lines. He had seen more death and destruction than any human being should witness. But he had also seen something else: the capacity of ordinary American soldiers to endure extraordinary hardship and emerge victorious through sheer determination. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge extended far beyond the casualty statistics recorded in official military histories. Thousands of American soldiers suffered permanent disabilities from frostbite and exposure, while others carried psychological scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The veterans of the Ardennes had paid a price in blood and suffering that earned them a permanent place in the pantheon of American military heroism, as referenced in the final after-action reports compiled by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. The Battle of the Bulge represented both the greatest German success and the most complete German failure of the entire Western campaign. Private Eugene Rodriguez of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, who had survived the Siege of Bastogne, walked through the streets of the liberated town on February 1st, 1945. Seeing signs of normal civilian life returning after weeks of combat, children emerged from basement shelters, shopkeepers began clearing debris from their stores, and church bells rang for the first time since December. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its lessons would resonate through American military doctrine for generations. The courage displayed by individual soldiers, the importance of strong leadership under extreme conditions, and the decisive advantage provided by superior logistics and industrial production had all been demonstrated during 6 weeks of the most intense combat American forces had experienced in Europe. As Allied armies prepared for the final advance into Germany itself, the veterans of the Ardennes carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the best the German army could offer and had emerged victorious through a combination of courage, endurance, and the unshakable belief that their cause was just. The frozen hell of the Ardennes had forged a generation of American soldiers who understood that victory in modern warfare demanded not only superior weapons and tactics, but also the moral strength to endure suffering and continue fighting when defeat seemed inevitable. Their legacy would inspire American military forces for decades to come.